I don't think any story has captivated me as much within the world of ufology as the Bob Lazar story. I would almost say that is the story that really got me into UFOs. When I heard this for the first time in the late 90s, I just wanted to find out what's going on. It immediately struck my curiosity and I wanted to just dive as deep as I could into it. Now, back in the days, it wasn't that possible. Now we get answers. We get some answers at least, and I've already done a video. You've probably seen it. Quite a few people have seen it. I'll link it on the top of the description. You can check it out. That video was mostly focused around some of the questions around Bob Lazar's past, the stuff that he allegedly did or didn't do before he allegedly worked at S4 and for the government. So it answered lots of those questions, but it obviously leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And I got a lot of comments under my other video of people raising those questions and saying, yeah, but you're ignoring this, that, and that. So in today's video, I want to do exactly that. I want to take the difficult questions that I didn't answer in my previous video and offer alternative explanations, if you want to put it this way. Nothing I'm going to say in this video I'm claiming to be an absolute fact, but I've put together a few interesting theories, I think, that might explain and answer some of the big questions around the Bob Lazar story. Like, for example, how did Bob know about the Wednesday night tests? He brought John Lear and others out in the desert. They recorded videos. They saw lights over the mountains. How did he know that? How did he know about element 115, allegedly before it was synthesized? He did receive a W-2 form from the government at the time. Allegedly, others observed him being intimidated. His name was in the Los Alamos phone book in 1982. How, loads of these questions. I'm going to address all of them one by one in this video. And then there are other questions beyond that. Like, for example, why did Bob Lazar never do an interview or sit down with like a proper physicist? Why did that never happen? It would be such an obvious thing to do with him claiming being a physicist. Why did he never testify in Congress is another question. And you bet that Jeremy Corbell most probably asked him, right? Anyway, generally, I would not be qualified to answer any of these questions personally because I'm not a physicist. I have no idea about those things. So I will heavily rely on this article written by a physicist called Tom Mahout. It is on his blog, on his website, which is called otherhand.org. I will link this article. It's really worth reading yourself. It's very detailed down in the description, so you can go check it out yourself. Now, Tom Mahout is a scientist. He is an engineer. He did work with Caltech in the past. He holds a master's degree in physics. So that is the author of this blog entry. I guess this is his website where he looks at curious phenomenon. He talks about Area 51 in general and the Bob Lazar story and a few other things. But it is obviously rooted in the brain of someone who's a physicist, okay? Someone who probably, and I don't want to speak for him, but addresses this from a very skeptical angle. But let's get started. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to try my best to take the points that he makes in this article, condense them for you guys, because it is a very, very in-depth, long article that provides proof and backup. And it's a lot of content and meat to the bone here. So what I'm going to attempt is condense it down for you guys into, here's the question, like how did he know about the Wednesday night tests? And then here is the answer that Tom Mahout in this blog entry on his website proposes. And then we can discuss it and you can leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. Again, I'm not claiming that anything I'm saying or that Tom Mahout says to be the ultimate truth. It is just a physicist sharing his opinion. And then if Bob is a physicist, he shares his opinion and I'm just an observer putting all this together. Okay, that's kind of how this works. Not speaking the ultimate truth. I'm just reflecting the opinions of this physicist and we're discussing options that hopefully give answers to his questions that go beyond aliens. So the idea of this video really is an exchange of theories, ideas, and beliefs. So feel free to share your beliefs about the story and what you think to be true down in the comment section below. I'm curious to hear it. Also, final disclaimer, feel free to use the timestamps. If you're just interested in finding the answer to one specific question, you can find the right question through the timestamp and then you get my answer there. All right, let's get into it. What about the glowing lights seen above Area 51 by Lazar and his friends? Now, this is a rather infamous part of the story, right? We even get this old, I assume, VHS tape of John Lear being filmed somewhere in the desert. So Bob Lazar took John Lear and some of his other friends out into the desert, I believe on a Wednesday night, and they observed things, lights, orbs over the mountains where Bob was saying they would be occurring, right? So that really raises two questions. Question number one is, how did Bob know this? How did he know the schedule if he never worked there and had nothing to do with these government tests? And the other question is, what are they testing? What's going on here? So let's try to answer them one by one. The author Tom Mahout, who again, as I said before, is also a physicist, puts forward a somewhat interesting theory here. He's obviously proposing that it's not UFOs that they were testing, but instead a plasma device. Now, hold on. You're like, why? What plasma device? That's really far-fetched. Wait a second. What he is describing is a proton beam device. Essentially, it is a particle beam that you fire into the atmosphere, and it creates, by hitting plasma or something, God, read the article yourself, right? It creates glowing orbs of light, glowing orbs of plasma in and around the sky, depending on how you activate them, so to say. Now, what is interesting is that theory is fully supported by physics. Okay, you can look up the Bragg curve, that's referenced by him there if you're into that kind of stuff. And also, if we can believe the research of Tom Mahout, it has also been corroborated by a particle physicist who is familiar with the Los Alamos operation. He himself, Tom Mahout, I assume, is probably very well connected in the scientific community. You write emails to people, they write emails to others, and you find someone who for some reason is somewhat familiar, without giving names, with the Los Alamos operation. And he found out that at the time, if I understand him correctly, they were pretty much testing technology like that in these areas. And the outcome of testing these technologies is orbs, glowing balls of lights above mountains floating around. Obviously, skeptics will be like, wait, that makes no sense. Aliens coming from 60 trillion light years away and then crashing here on this planet, and then it's being retrieved, and now we're test flying in the desert. That makes so much more sense. Now, as you can imagine, Tom Mahout, the author of this article that I'm referencing here, gets a lot of messages of people saying that makes absolutely no sense. So he wrote a follow-up article just about this one question, titled, "So You Don't Believe It Was a Proton Beam, eh?" And he goes into a lot of detail, how it makes sense, how it was relevant at the time. He's just giving way more in-depth. And if you're really into the truth about this story, and you're not just like, yeah, I just want my bias to be confirmed, it's got to be aliens. If you really want to know, read the main article, which I'm going to link down in the description. And if you want to dive even deeper, read this article about the proton beams. It is very, very interesting. But it does raise the question, why? Why would we shoot plasma balls into the sky? This makes no sense, monkey. You are talking out of your monkey behind. No, actually, the theory behind these tests was radar spoofing. So they were obviously testing this in a secret facility away from public eyes, and they were trying to create the illusion of an object in the sky that's not actually there, and then that would be picked up by radar, or it's not picked up by radar, but people see it with their eyes. It creates confusion, okay? It is a weapon that creates confusion in potential enemies. It is something that the military explores. We know, if we can trust Tom Mahout, that at the time, particle physicists at Los Alamos were working on these kinds of technologies. So I think it's quite likely that that could potentially explain what these glowing orbs and the lights they were seeing over the mountains were. But monkey, it still doesn't answer the question, how did Bob know? That's right, we're getting to it, okay? That feeds into a different question I'm going to ask later, so sit back, relax. We're going to get to that, I promise you. But first, let's look at the next question. Why was his name in the Los Alamos phone book in 1982 while he called himself a physicist? Now, we know that Bob Lazar claims to be a physicist. We know that he allegedly was recruited by Edward Teller, that his credentials, his educational credentials were deleted, and that's why there's no proof of him. We'll get to that a little bit later, but it is a fact that his name was in the Los Alamos phone book in 1982. Now, here you have to watch out for a little bit of a logical fallacy here, right? Like, his name is in the phone book. That is true. That is a fact. His name is in the phone book. But that does not automatically confirm or prove that he was a physicist. Many people work for Los Alamos Labs, and his name appeared in the Los Alamos National Labs phone directory with the K/M designation behind it, okay, which distinguished him as a contractor. And the article by Tom Mahout also claims that he worked as a contract electronic technician via Kirk Meier. So allegedly, if we can trust this research, Bob Lazar was not a physicist. He was an electronic technician, like a radio technician, or someone who comes in and fixes fairly basic tech. Now again, this is the research of Tom Mahout. I've seen this theory by other researchers being put forward, but it is confirmed, if we can believe this research, that Kirk Meier did not contract physicists at the time. The article itself states Lazar had some electronic technical education from Pierce College in Southern California and had some work experience with Fairchild, so he was hired as an electronic technician with Kirk Meier. I have interviews with several people who worked with him, and he was described as a very clever troubleshooter and fix-it guy. He was there often enough to get listed in the Los Alamos National Lab phone directory with the denotation KM next to his name, indicating his affiliation with Kirk Meier. So now I start to see how some of these puzzle pieces come together. He was possibly, if we can believe this, I will just for the second assume that what he researched and what he says here is true. He was a radio technician or a electronic technician who comes in to fix his tech, and he was contracted out by Kirk Meier at the time. And Kirk Meier was contracting with Los Alamos and with government contractors at the time, so they would be renting out electronic technicians to labs like the Los Alamos lab. And that's how Bob would potentially get into Los Alamos lab, get an idea how it looks, familiarize himself a little bit with the space potentially, and maybe see a schedule of something taking place, like a test in a facility at a certain time. Maybe he got a glance while he was there. But what about his knowledge of element 115? And what about the polygraph tests that he passed? Now, obviously, I can't say anything about element 115, but the author of the article says, again, who is a physicist, saying his knowledge of element 115 being stable pre-synthesis was already present in scientific speculation. So he's not the first one to come up with the idea or theorize that element 115 could exist in a stable form. And furthermore, it was a somewhat hot topic in the scientific community at the time. Check out this little snippet from a video also about Bob Lazar from an account called Robot Hand, okay? Smash like on his video. I'll link it in the description.
In 1989, Scientific America did a story on the possibilities of creating element 115. There's probably a good chance Bob was interested in this magazine. That story was published in May of that year, just 2 weeks before Bob came forward with his amazing story. Man.
Okay, so you kind of get the gist. It could be coincidence, right? I'm not saying this is definitely the answer. Again, this is not what I'm saying on any of these questions, but dude, it's a bit sus, man. It's Scientific America running a story about that just before he comes out with his story, and he talks about element 115. I believe the story was called Island of Stability. It's a theory, or like a theory published in Scientific American, so you can look it up yourself. But there you go, okay? It's another puzzle piece where we can almost trace back where he may or may not have gotten the idea to talk about these things from. But Monkey, what about the 2 polygraph tests? He passed 2 polygraph tests. That is true. I believe, allegedly, he passed 2 polygraph tests, but he also failed one. Okay, and polygraph tests are generally not evidence. They can be manipulated. It's not really a lie detector. We call it a lie detector. That's not what it is. It can't be used in courts and so on. It's not reliable. Okay, so yes, he passed 2 lie detector tests. That's not evidence. That's not bad, but it's not what we would consider evidence. And to be honest, it's not that far detached from pseudoscience. But let's move on. Lazar's descriptions of the saucer's function, are they scientifically plausible? Now again, a question that I'm feeding the answer from this article written by a physicist. And this author, Tom Mahout, says, not at all. His claims about the saucer grabbing distant portions of space-time and kind of pulling it towards that are so scientifically nonsensical that the author says Lazar's idea are essentially not even wrong. Had such a vehicle existed, the gravitational waves produced would have disrupted instruments like the LIGO, yet none of them were observed. So he's basically saying that if we would have technology that could generate that much energy to produce that kind of effect, like grabbing distant portions of space-time and pulling it towards you, so much energy is needed that it would disrupt the sensors that we have just spying all around Earth, and it would be such a spike that everyone would be like, what the hell was that? But that didn't happen. That never happened. So he speculates that from a scientific point of view, it makes no sense. And obviously, for that, just a little bit of my own opinion here. Again, I'm not a physicist, but of course, it makes no sense from today's viewpoint of science. But if I remember correctly, Bob also said that the spacecraft could create a bubble, a gravitational bubble around itself, generating its own completely disconnected field of gravity that only works within the craft. And that's why it can be very fast, accelerate, take 90-degree turns at impossible speeds. You will never hear it going through the sound barrier, for example, because it doesn't apply, because it actually doesn't go through the sound barrier. It sits in its own bubble. So that's a theory that obviously at the moment is science fiction, but the problem that we have is we haven't really figured out how gravity works, or at least how we can replicate it. We don't know what we need to do in order to create a bubble of gravity, but others may have figured it out, and I'm talking about other civilizations. It is a very far-fetched theory, and I don't see evidence for any of it, and obviously from today's point of view of physicists and scientists, it makes no sense, it is impossible, but I think in the bigger picture of evolution, hopefully going forward another 1,000 years, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years, at some point it may become possible. So just because we can't produce it at the moment, I'm not saying I'm disagreeing with his assessment here. Obviously, from a logical and 2025 perspective, it's absolutely correct. But to me, these kinds of arguments sometimes lack a little bit the imagination, right? They lack the imagination to say, yes, right now, absolutely not. But in theory, if we could generate that amount of energy somehow, then maybe, and if, So anyway, that's just my take on that. What about the whatabouts? How Lazar could know specifics like S4, Groom Lake facilities, Teller's reaction, W2 forms, and more. Let's go through these questions one by one because there's quite a few here and I don't want to spend too much time on each one, but let's go through them. So the first one is, how could Bob possibly know specifics like S4, the Groom Lake facilities, and so on? And the author of this article I'm referencing says that Lazar probably knew the physical layout, the personnel potentially of Groom Lake because he worked there briefly and had some access. Now, obviously, that is a theory, but it kind of ties back into the whole Kirk Meyer thing and him being like an electronic technician that is contracted to the government. And it is not unthinkable that the government would say, okay, you know what, we've got some serious problems. This guy is a good troubleshooter. He fixes problems. He's good at that. Problem is out in the Groom Lake facility. Let's fly the guy out. Let's put him on one of those Janet flights. Get him out in the morning, he can get it fixed, he come back. So it is possible that in his capacity as a contractor for Kirk Meyer, as an electronic technician, he flew out there and he literally visited the facility and he walked around in it and he saw it. Now, S4 is obviously a different question. But you have to understand that people like John Lear were also talking about S4. Who knows, maybe potentially conversations happened while he was at Groom Lake. Maybe he was hanging out in the cafeteria with many of the other guys, some of the engineers, some of the scientists. Someone got talking, assuming that everyone has the clearance. Who knows, talking about that other facility, that S4 facility. Also, S4 was initially known as a testing site at Tonopah Test Range, which is often called Area 52. Okay, it's like in pop culture. It's not at Papoose Lake. So the term S4 doesn't even originate from there. So it is very likely and possible that the idea of there being an S4 facility somewhere close to the Groom Lake facility is just not true. Again, I don't know, but we know that John Lear spoke about it. We know that S4 linked more to Area 52, which is not in that area. So it just raises a whole bunch of questions where I'm like, I'm not sure this is enough for me to kind of buy into S4 really existing. Now let's talk briefly about the Edward Teller involvement. Edward Teller, obviously, allegedly, famously the man who recruited Bob Lazar. He, again, allegedly met him during one of his lectures and then recommended him to go into S4. But when George Knapp contacted Teller years later to confirm these claims that Bob Lazar made, Teller kind of in this interview became uncomfortable and then he cut the interview short, and loads of people are obviously interpreting that as a confession, right? Like, oh, he gets awkward and cuts the interview short because he's uncomfortable talking about the truth that Bob Lazar broke. In the interview, he didn't outright deny that he knew Bob Lazar or that any of the claims that he made happened, but he did kind of refuse to talk about the story further. And my theory is that Teller's awkward reaction likely stemmed from him having recommended Lazar, right? And kind of having kickstarted all this. Maybe he really recommended him and he just feels very, very awkward of what that story became, because it can obviously also negatively reflect on his reputation. So I don't think it makes much sense that Teller was reacting in that way because he wasn't ready to talk about the truth. I think it is much more about him feeling awkward about that potential recommendation. Again, that's just my opinion. And it was not coming from any conspiratorial knowledge or so on. And just a quick sentence on the W2 form. This has been debunked many, many times, but the W2 form simply reflects Lazar's short-term work. Okay, it's no evidence of S4 or Area 51 or any alien involvement, anything like that. It is just that he worked at some point in some capacity with or for the government. That's what it proves, but it doesn't prove anything beyond that. And if we can believe the claims around Kirk Meyer and him being a technician, then that actually makes more sense to me than his story. But let's move on. What about Lazar's jet car and his technical credibility? Now here the author answers pretty clear. He says, Lazar's jet car, powered by a Glue-Haref pressure jet engine, and I hope I said this right, probably not, but the power it produced was exaggerated, if you can believe the author. He claimed it produced 1,600 pounds of thrust and was highly fuel efficient, both of which are unsupported. The most powerful real Glue-Haref engine produces only 700 pounds of thrust, and even inefficient jet engines like the Concorde outperformed Lazar's claimed efficiency. Again, the author is going into way more detail detail about all this, but I don't think anyone denies that Lazar built that vehicle or that he turned it into this hydrogen version of a Corvette. But how efficient it really was, how well made it really was, and how much fuel it actually required, it's somewhat shrouded in mystery. And again, it links back to him being a technician. I know people who do incredible things with cars. They are not physicists, okay? They're just very good with building engines and taking them apart and reassembling them. And so while it is obviously quite an achievement, right, to build an engine like that into a Corvette, I'm not marginalizing it, but it is not evidence that he is actually a physicist or some kind of engineer. What about Lazar's academic claims? Masters from Caltech and MIT? Is it real? What's going on there? Well, the author says these are all false. This is also what Stanton Friedman claimed at the time. There are no records, allegedly, of him attending either of these institutions, Caltech or MIT. Now, Bob claims that these educational records were deleted, okay, as part of the conspiracy against him. They try to discredit him. They try to make his story less believable and credible. That's why they deleted his records. But you have to understand, on one hand, probably Lazar would have some kind of certificate of graduation, right? That's one thing that would exist somewhere. But even that wouldn't exist. Even he lost that or never got it or whatever it is. It's not just the paperwork that proves that you were at a facility like that. You can speak to the other students. You can speak to the tutors, right? To the teachers. Now, Bob gave some of the names of his alleged teachers while at Caltech and MIT, and he called them Duxler and Hosefield, them being two separate teachers. These did not exist in any of these universities, if we can believe the author, again, of this article. But Stan Friedman said he was searching for Duxler and had no such person ever taught at Caltech and MIT. However, he did find a William Duxler who taught math and physics at Pierce College and confirmed to Friedman that Lazar had taken at least one of his courses in the 1970s. So here now, if you can trust this research, you have a teacher whose name matches the name that Bob Lazar claimed he worked at Caltech and MIT, but he was actually just a physics and math teacher at Pierce College, which we know that Bob attended, and he says Bob attended at least one of his classes in the 1970s. So did he just get the names mixed up? Did he just take the name of his college teacher there and then applied it and said that, like, I was at Caltech, the guy had the same name? What a coincidence. Anyway, Stanton Friedman also found Frederick Hosefield, the other name that Bob put forward, and he was teaching electronics at Bob's high school. Okay. No former classmates, faculty, directories lists, yearbooks, any of those things. Let's just say the government did a really, really thorough job of deleting all his credentials and educational records, because even all his former classmates don't remember, and he remembers none of the names of the teachers that are verifiable, and nobody remembers anything. It's almost like it never happened, but that can't be the case, right? That can't be right. Why did Lazar tell his story? What was his motive? Now, obviously, if you ask 20 people, you're going to get 25 opinions on that, and you can leave yours down in the comment section below. I'm curious to hear why you think Bob did that. Assuming that it might not be true, again, we're all speculating here, right? We're exchanging thoughts. But what may have been his motive? The author's theory is that Lazar created the UFO narrative primarily to save face and to avoid prosecution or professional consequences after bringing friends to a classified proton beam test. When caught, he doubled down on the story, gaining media attention and a degree of protective publicity, effectively becoming a minor celebrity to stay out of jail. Okay, obviously this is just the theory that the author of this article and physicist Tom Mahout is putting forward. I don't know, I'm not confirming that this is true, but this is an interesting theory, right? Because if that is true, if he used the information that he maybe secretly or, on a side note kind of observed while doing technician work at Los Alamos, and he was like, this is going to be huge, guys. We're going out there checking out those plasma particle tests or whatever. And he brings his friends and they got caught, right? I think that's confirmed that they got caught. So now they knew he brought those guys out there. They knew that he snitched on that information. That's not good, okay? It's not half as bad as snitching on alien tech, but it's still not great. So that would also potentially explain where the intimidation is coming from. Again, according to the theory of the author, is like he got so intimidated that he made the step forward. He put another shovel on top and said, actually, I was in all the bases and I've seen incredible things. And then it took on a life of its own, way beyond George Knapp and Las Vegas, and it became this huge worldwide phenomenon. And now we know where it is now. Obviously, it's a theory. I don't know the motive of Bob Lazar, only he does, but it's an interesting theory. So let's move on. And that brings us to the final takeaway of what's going on here. Now, I'm going to share my thoughts, share yours down in the comment section below. But obviously, the author of this amazing article looking at the Bob Lazar story from the perspective of 2018 and from the perspective of a real physicist. What does the author conclude? Well, he says, Lazar's story unravels under scrutiny. The supposed UFO were particle plasma phenomenon, his credentials and descriptions were exaggerated or false, and his insider knowledge derived from brief technical work, not alien encounters. A more plausible, non-existential explanation exists for every aspect of Lazar's tale. It all amounts to a fabricated story built and sustained to protect himself and cash in on sensationalism. Now, again, that's not my opinion. That is Tom Mahout's opinion. This is kind of the conclusion of this article here. I'm just kind of summarizing and reading it out. But I think he makes a good point in saying that every element of the Bob Lazar story has another answer that you can take instead of it being aliens and instead of him visiting S4. Every question has another, in my opinion, more reasonable answer. The decision is yours to make, right? You need to decide what you choose to believe. I don't think we'll ever find out any objective truth on this story. But in my opinion, especially if you go through the questions like we just now one by one and you kind of look at alternative explanations and research into the subject, it does certainly feel like it somewhat crumbles. If he would come forward and say, well, my tutor at this university was that, and at Caltech I had this guy and that woman, and here was this other guy at MIT, and they would all exist, I'd be like, okay, at least he did his research, and probably, let's be honest, probably he could have found that out. If Bob Lazar would have dug deeper, he could have found out some professor, some people that worked at the time at these facilities. It sounds to me like when he was making these claims, and again, I'm wildly speculating here, right? But when Bob Lazar made these claims about these names and he put the names forward of these teachers, he did not anticipate that this story would get this big and that it would get that much out of hand and that people would contact these institutions and double and triple check every single word that he says. Now that's where we are. You have to decide what you make of these stories. I will link the original article on otherhand.org down in the description. As I said, everything I mentioned and shown here, I will link everything down in the description. Please don't forget to share your opinion down in the comments about the Bob Lazar story. Do you think it's real? What are your thoughts? Any thoughts that come to mind? I'm curious. You can join our Discord if you want to continue the conversation. The link is in the description. It's a great community. Come over, hang out. You can talk to me and many others. Not just about UFOs, right? We talk about anything from religion to politics, everything. So join our Discord through the link in the description. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, subscribe, smash like, do the things. Consider checking out the merch. We have merch. All that good stuff is linked in the description. I see you later. Take care of yourselves. Thanks for watching and I'm out. Bye.